There we go. Now we're working. Now we're doing all the things we're doing. Hello and welcome back. This is yet another thrilling adventure in the world of writing fundamentals, where today, as we have been talking about character and plot, now we're going to complete our look at the story triangle by taking a look at world building. And now it's important to point out that in the course of world building, this is so often referred to as like the least important part. Like, characters are more exciting, plot's more interesting, and the world is just kind of catch-all everything else. And that's untrue. That is inaccurate. World building is a third of the whole three-sided thing. It is the idea that you can't have the plot and the characters without world building. Because without a world, there's no facility for plot. And without a world, the characters don't have a place to do the plot. Like, world holds it all together. You can think of it as the stage and environment where the story takes place, and it's the place where the characters exist. It's very straightforward. That said, world building is where bad writers run away and hide. World building is fun. And it's easy because there's no stakes. There's nobody coming to stop you. You can just invent and invent and invent and masturbate and diddle around and do fuck all and feel like you're really getting a lot done. Because look, I'm making all these decisions and I'm coming up with all this stuff. But at the end of the day, your lack of discipline and your just constant running at the mouth is getting you nowhere. It does not improve your craft. It's just... you're just taking up time and space when you could be doing other stuff. Building your world is about understanding the relationship between what you need and what you have and what you do. And to sit there and dick around with, I'm going to have this, and what about this, and what about this, and just trying to see how imaginative you can be, you are missing the fundamental point of world building. Because if your world building can be defeated by two questions, you've wasted everybody's time. And those two questions are why and so what. If you get stuck on so what, you're missing significant value in your work. So what? Why? Who cares that you made 11 continents and 6 kingdoms and, that whole place is ruled by penguins? So what? If you can't tie it back to what you were doing, if you can't use this information in this creative space to forward a specific and particular agenda in a particular way, what are we doing here? Why? So what? Those two questions are torpedoes for world building. And most of the time, when you get an indecisive, inexperienced writer crafting a ton of stuff with no real structure to it, just look how imaginative I'm being. Yay! Why and so what will stop you? Because the excuse usually spins around to, well, I don't know, but it might be useful later. It's very, very seldom going to be useful later. You don't have to do that much world building. You just don't. You don't need to figure out like the backstory of those trees over there or that guy in that cottage way down the road. Like, it just doesn't, it's not very, very nice for you to invent that stuff, but you genuinely don't need it. The function of world building is to facilitate the active focus of your story. Your world, I'm making air quotes, your world is going to feel plenty lived in and realistic and well developed if you just focus somewhere rather than show off the 10 bajillion other places that you've crafted or the 45 other ideas. Because, this is going to be part of a series, so I got to lay this groundwork for book 7 on page 3 of book 1. And you don't. Remember, you don't have to do that much. Do not make an already hard thing, telling a story, harder by just running wild with no stakes and no structure. So what do we do? How do we turn world building to our advantage? It's very straightforward. You've got to remember that world building is not backstory, and world building is not lore. It can be those things, but that's like saying 20% of an iceberg is an iceberg, or that 20% of dinner is just the stuff you put on your fork. It is a part of a whole. There are fundamentally 4 different layers to world building. And when you answer those 4 layers, you're done. Done. Simple done. And it does not need to be more complicated than that. It does not need to be anything more than that, because world building's job is to answer questions. And if you can think about it in terms of 4 layers, global, environmental, societal, and personal, sometimes also called self, you can map the majority of the world building needs you have across 4 layers. Like this nice handy chart. Global is the macroest level, the biggest level. That's your, generally how does the world exist? Gravity, science, physics, temperature, weather, biomes. Well, that's more environmental, but it's the big zoomed out picture. Most of the time we shorthand that to, it's like Earth, and then we don't have to worry about it. And then environmental is where we start getting creative, like it's this continent and this kingdom and this valley and this forest, and it's temperate and it snows over here, et cetera, et cetera. It's the environment. And then we come down to societal, and societal is the level where, oh man, everybody just likes to go to town. We have a bajillion different things. Inequalities, power dynamics, structures, societies, kingdoms, rulers, leadership, famous things, points of interest. Like we're giving a tour guide view of the world. Nobody needs that. You don't need to do that. That's not important. But that's the level at which everybody just kind of likes to write, because look, they're writing. Yay. But you're missing the point. And then finally at the lowest level, the level of self, it's where the character comes into play in world building. How does somebody living in this world exist? What do they do? What is a random person right there? Like, I'm looking out my window right now. There's my next door neighbor. He's sweeping his patio. Cool. How does he exist in the world? Whatever your world is. What would he do? He doesn't have to be special. He doesn't have to be the main character. He's just the idiot over there sweeping his patio. How does he exist? We want to think of world building as answering questions from the macro down to the micro. And we build our world in layers. So let's start taking a look at stuff. We're going to start with global. Biggest scale. How does the scale operate? And for the vast majority of everybody, good writers, bad writers, famous writers, writers you've never heard of, the answer is going to be, it's like Earth, or it's like Earth, but. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But we've got to think about this in terms of answering questions. So we start coming up with questions. And a lot of these are going to be real quick, yes, no, because that's just how it is. Is there oxygen? Is there gravity? Is there weather? Are there continents? Are there flora and fauna? Are there cities? Are there vehicles? Where is this story? What's going on? What's the big zoomed out level here? We don't need to know it's a confederation of 11 kingdoms ruled by a guy named Tim. We don't need any of that. We just need to know, oh, it's a bunch of kingdoms. Stop there. That's enough. Why do we stop there? Because you want to fill those details in when you write it at the time. Coming to your draft with a ton of backstory, a ton of prep, like we're going to set up our D&D campaign for the next 15 years, is not helping you. This is not a D&D campaign. This is not a massive, world campaign guide you're going to sell for $39.99 at your local game store. This is the material you need to allow your story, which is fairly specific and much smaller, to exist. We don't need the history of every country. We don't need to know that 11 kingdoms ago there was a princess and that lady's now got the same name as our protagonist. Doesn't matter, because it's about the protagonist far more than about the backstory. So we just ask big questions at the global level. How does science work? How does the world operate? Does it have day-night cycles? Simple, fundamental things that for the most of the stories get completely overlooked because they're just sort of assumed. For instance, go look at, grab 5 web novels. Do you honestly think reading that they stop to consider whether or not their magical portal romance is currently taking place on an Earth surrogate planet? Or are they just in a kingdom having a story with two hunky dudes macking on each other? Global world building is the first layer of framework to move things forward. On we go to our second level, environmental. How do we distinguish one space from another? Again, it's going to be like Earth, so we're going to have continents and biomes. And we have to do better than that, though. Because where and how is our story not like Earth? Because, I mean, let's say you're writing a modern romance and you're going to set it on Earth in a fictional version of, I don't know, Chicago. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Totally fine. You can't suddenly change that Earth because it's not important to the story. It's just the story takes place in Chicago. Fine. Cool. But to answer that question, this made-up version of our Chicago romance is different than the real-life Chicago because the characters in it are made up. The environmental level helps us distinguish one space from the other. What kind of biomes exist? How does geography affect people? Why does the kingdom live on this side of the mountain and not the other side? Why do they travel so far to the city via bus? Why isn't it closer? Why hasn't urban sprawl come this far? How does distance and terrain affect people and civilization? How does space, the distance between things, the height of buildings, the use of the underground cave network, etc., how does space affect your story? These are all environmental concerns. We usually hand wave a lot of this away by saying stuff like, oh, well, the space is as big as it needs to be. Or I guess we have an underground catacomb system now. Well, okay, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But when we're thinking about environmental world building, we're thinking about space and distance and separation and distinction from one thing to another. On we go. Societal. The level wherein everybody kind of bloats up their story. We want to think about this in terms of not just name a bunch of things and have a bunch of stuff happen in the past, but we want to think about this in terms of how can we use these questions to fuel our ongoing or soon to be written story. And the easiest way to do that is to break it into two questions first and foremost, and then subdivide thereafter. So our big questions are, what kinds of inequality exist? All different kinds. Name them, find them. We don't need to list all of them. You'll go crazy trying to map out every inch of everything. But there has to be some kind of inequality. There has to be. Maybe it's something as simple as one of these people studied for the test in our YA novel versus somebody didn't. Or maybe it's more profound, like gender or racial or sexual inequality, or financial or economic or medical or ability or something. But there are going to be some levels of inequality, some levels of separation, some levels of distinction. Find them. Because those are fuel for plot and subplot and character arc. The other sort of big go-to question is, who has what and who wants what? Who has a thing and who wants a thing? Again, we are just trying to facilitate connecting our world to our plot, or our world to our characters and their arcs and their goals or their drives or their skills. Who has something somebody else wants? Why do they want it? What kind of inequality exists? What are some rules of the world? The rules of Kingdom A do not necessarily need to be the rules of Kingdom B, but that does not mean you need to write the Constitution or the code for Kingdom A and B to the end, to every last rule and clause. You don't need to. No one gives a shit. But if you can understand and summarize that this kingdom has rules that are written and unwritten, if there's inequality between groups based on this criteria or that criteria, all of a sudden, rather than just saying there's peasants and fantasy creatures, it suddenly becomes much more interesting, much more engaging, because there is potential here. The reason why we think about inequality or schisms or gaps and stuff is because we are looking for places where tension could exist, can exist, does exist. And in that tension, we seed story. That's where story lives. Nobody's going to give a shit if everything's just cool, except there's a random bad guy who's just bad for some reason. That's lazy. We don't want to be lazy. We want to be detailed. We want to be engaging. Look for those cracks and gaps in the smooth pavement of the metaphorical sidewalk. The things that are out of place, the things that could be out of place, the things under pressure, the people under pressure. People's desires and tensions and necessities butting up against each other. That's all formed and framed at the societal level. Why are we the way we are? Capitalism. We somehow still believe that the quality of our work dictates to the value of our personhood. We still think currency is a good idea. We don't think things that are human rights need to be just universal. We need to, attach price tags to them and stuff. Those are societal level questions. That level of thought matters to some degree because it's, at the societal level where the character interfaces with other humans. But at the same time, it needs to... You need to sort of put a ceiling on it. You need to put a lid on it because you can't cover everything. Not every story about the young, upstart, scrappy, kid from the wrong side of the tracks needs to turn into an empire toppling, super special prophesied rebel kid. Sometimes it's just a snot-nosed kid with a spear, as opposed to the long promised chosen one. Sometimes it's just a kid with a stick, and that's fine, and it's okay. It doesn't always need to be big prophecy. It doesn't always need to be these sort of massive, huge stakes. Sometimes the smallest stakes of, hey, I know how I'm going to survive today is more than enough. Societal level development really matters, but do not confuse societal development for history because it's not the same thing. World building is about the active world that the characters exist in now. It has somewhat to do with the past because the past sort of set up the present. But most times the characters who are living in the situations they're living in don't have the luxury, ability, or time or opportunity to sit there and go, gosh, I wonder what decision it was 60 years ago that brought me to this point I'm at now. Because they're busy, trying to survive. They don't have enough chance to stop and go, gosh, I wish that politician did different. Societal level. Juicy for its potential tensions. On we go. I promise you, we're almost done. Self. The lowest level. The most micro level. This is answering the question of what is life like for someone in your story. And this should not be limited to your main character, because your main character is not the only human or being that exists in your story. So how do we frame these questions differently if we're just looking at one person? Well, what challenges does this person face day to day? How does the world they live in make these or permit these or have these challenges in the first place? What can somebody do, if anything, to change their circumstances? In all these situations that they're dealing with, where are the good things? Because the world has to have good things. They might be small, like, oh, hey, I found, a coin in the road that a merchant dropped. Or, oh my God, I get to take a nap later. There's going to be moments of joy. But there are also going to be moments of pain. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm stuck here, cleaning out the fancy sci-fi tech term for a thing. There's going to be pain and there's going to be joy. How does the world allow, facilitate, or continue to let these things happen? And sort of big, broad question, why isn't it easier for everybody to get what they want? If your world is so rich with history and stuff, well, why doesn't the bad guy just get what they want? What's in the way? If they're so super powerful, this great wizard, this big giant ruler with this massive army. Why haven't they just taken over? What's in the way? Maybe that obstacle is internal to the character. The wizard, thinks it'll be too easy, so they're delaying it. They enjoy the exquisite torture of the exploitation of the peasantry. I don't know. But if they're that powerful, why didn't they just steamroll everything? Why can't everybody just get what they want sooner rather than later? At the self level, the lowest level of world building, you are thinking about how to connect your main character to the experience of being in the world of the story. Because your character's doing something. They have a plot. They have an arc. They have a main plot. There's stuff, right? Your character is one being in the world of your story. And the world puts pressure and exerts forces on that character to affect and influence how they're doing whatever it is they're trying to do. The reason why humans aren't flying around like Superman is because humans can't fly. Now, we write that off to gravity, but if we think about the number of problems we could solve by being able to move not only, on a left-right vertical axis, but to really change the z-axis and add more directions and vectors, life changes. The same thing would happen if you gave anybody superpowers or mutant powers. The self level is about plugging a person into your world and making the world feel developed, while also allowing the character to do whatever it is they need to do. It can be really tempting to only do this for your protagonist, or only do this for your main protagonist and your antagonist, and then kind of sort of hand wave it in the direction of everybody else. Like, yeah, they have feelings. It sucks. Do this for everybody. Do this equally. If you're going to spend time filling and padding out the idea and spending time working laterally away from your main text and just kind of developing this on the side and that on the side and this over here on the side, at least keep it in the ballpark of something that facilitates the rest of your story. Again, we're not trying to come up with backstory. We're not trying to sit here and come up with like the seeds for my 12-book series were planted, 30 years prior when the wizard had soup. No, doesn't need to be that. World building is just about crafting a space for your story to be experienced within. It is important to note that all your characters, all of them, I don't care who it is, they have a problem or conflict or something to resolve. We recognize that thing as the plot, and the world as they know it either makes that possible or more difficult to resolve. And that is based on how they know the world to be. A very simple example, Star Wars. Prior to Luke discovering that, there's a force and that his dad was a big deal, because prior to that, everybody told him that his dad was a drug smuggler. Prior to just being the kid on the moisture farm on the desert planet out in the middle of nowhere, the farm boy, it became more difficult for Luke to change anything about how he wanted to live his life. He was going to go transmit his application to the academy and just kind of hopefully get off this rock and go do whatever. But once he changed what he knew of the world, hey, look, it's that British actor who's going to, be a mentor to me for about 2/3 of this movie. And then he gets kind of caught up in the whole idea of like rebellion and fighting the Empire and stuff. The world as your character knows it makes it possible or more difficult to do the stuff they want to do. The stuff they want to do and doing it should never be impossible for them to do. It can be completely unknown how they're going to go from point A to point B. That's what the story is for, to figure that out. But it should not be impossible. Just hard and unknown. World building creates and amplifies tension. All the tensions. All the, how are they going to do this? What about the fill in the blanks? all that stuff, all the unknown and all the risk and all the challenge is boosted by world building being a thing. Let's take a look at some examples. So let's suppose we'll do 3. Let's suppose we have 19th century English countryside. Maybe it's a Regency romance. We set it on Earth in the 1940s. It's got all the Earth rules, but it's set in the 1940s or the 1840s. So we have to sort of restrain ourselves in terms of like, nobody's sending a text message. Nobody's on Snapchat. There's no TikTok. We've got horses and we have, long handwritten letters. No TV. Nobody's going to chat about what they watched last night. But also, we have all the usual inequalities and disparities. Those are our sort of 2 dominant examples of world building. We know it's a time frame, we know it's like Earth, and we know it has a certain vibe and atmosphere to it. Let's go take a look at a different one. Let's go take a look at 21st century New York City, which is Earth right now. So we get to use all the technology and all the usual stuff we use all the time. And also, just like the 19th century, we get all the usual inequalities and disparities. Hey, look, things haven't really changed. Only now we're going to add an extra wrinkle because in our 21st century New York City story, magic and technology exist side by side because maybe it's an urban fantasy novel. Did we sit down and figure out the complexities of every inch of the magic system? No. That's a whole different, probably a whole different video by itself. But the world building can just be magic and tech exist side by side. And when we have to sort out how that happens and how that works, we sort it out on the page of the moment. We don't map it out all in advance. There isn't a test on your own work, so no one needs to stop and double check. You can figure this stuff out on the page. But let's say we're writing sci-fi. Let's go like way far in the future. How about we do the 47th century on in the system Sagiphon 12? It's a space station on the edge of an asteroid belt. Maybe it's a YA story. And it's a space station. There's an asteroid belt. Cool. Our big sort of factor for world building is there are more have-nots than haves, whatever that turns into. If we sort of take a second to sidestep back to our character discussion we had several weeks ago when we talked about high concept, and we were just sort of summarizing the character in a way we could understand. Ellen Ripley is your alien survivor, that kind of thing. A statement like, there are more have-nots than haves, becomes a high concept for the world. Your world can have a high concept. There's more have-nots than haves. So no matter what we're talking about, food, clothing, guns, money, power, opportunity, whatever, there are more have-nots than haves. Straightforward. Simple. On we go. Let's dig a little deeper. So if we were going to start coming up with locations and places and stuff for our stories, basically turning our world building into a field document, a rough map, a list of all our necessary pieces of data we were just going to compile in one spot. For our 19th century English countryside, we need to invent a place where our story takes place. So let's create the Blingsley estate and all the grounds. Do I need to be a world-class expert? Do I need to spend days, weeks, months Googling and reading about the architecture or the way hedges were trimmed or any shit like that? No, I don't need any of that. Why? Don't need to. Just don't plain need to. A lot of writers at this point, they get very cranky in advance because they're like, well, we need it to feel realistic. Why? It's a made-up story. What you're anticipating and what you're getting all hot and bothered about is somebody complaining about reality versus your story. You don't need to be a world expert in a real world thing in order to transplant that sense of realness to your made up thing. You don't need to spend 20 years becoming an expert in fashion in order to write a story where people wear dresses. You just don't. You need to know some terminology. names, jargon, the name of the right kind of mannequin or tuck or dart or something, but you don't need to know every ins and outs. Yeah, there are going to be people in the world who jump on the internet to bitch, piss, and moan about whatever it is because they're going to look for fault. Your job is to write your story. Your job is to not try and make that very obviously miserable person happy. You don't have to apologize to them. You don't have to try and make it up to them. You don't need to take them to dinner and prove that you're good enough for them. You just leave them over there and let them be miserable. It's going to be fine. You tell your story. And if that means in your world, your 19th century English countryside includes 2 outdoor fountains, well, then I guess it does. You're the author. You made it up. That's what we have. Totally fine. Even though statistically it is unlikely that you will have the plumbing in place for 2 fountains. Cool. I guess you have 2 fountains. Great. On we go. What else can we do in our 19th century story? Well, everybody has a servant and a secret and a plan for the weekend, because maybe our story takes place over the weekend. That's all world building detail. Notice we didn't sit down and go, there are 14 rooms in the Blingsley estate, and we're going to start from the left, and the carpet is this color, and there's this tapestry. No one cares. And knowing that in advance does not help you, because all that's going to do down the road is tie your hands. Because if you go, well, I have to have 6 windows, because on my piece of paper, on my outline, in my planning for this, I said it has 6 windows, but I need the room to be dark. Well, then I guess it doesn't have 6 windows. I guess it's got 3 really big ones with curtains. Don't confuse trying to be descriptive and be detailed with the necessity of being, I'm making air quotes, right. Because that's not what this is about. Let's go look at 21st century New York City. Our story takes place in the winter of 2025. Right now. We know, what else can we talk about with this world? There are fantasy creatures that have real world problems. There are dragons on unemployment. There are fairies who are trying to become YouTubers. Sure, why not? That sounds cool. And what else can we have in our story? Well, magic is messy and chaotic. Okay. Do we know if that's a hard or soft system? Is it an elemental system? Does it use Vancian structure with verbal, somatic, and material components? I don't know. Maybe you don't know either. That's fine. Figure that out later. There will probably be, at some point, a whole other discussion to have specifically about how to make magic. That is not for right now. I will answer questions about it, but that's a whole separate thing. But for now, in the course of you doing your world building, you don't need to map it all out in advance. Are we seeing that? Is that becoming clear? And lastly, when we go over here to the 47th century in Sachephon 12, what do we have going on here with our space station at the edge of the asteroid belt? Well, gravity is intermittent and the station's undergoing renovations. Do we need to know where? No. Why? Because that way when we're writing it down and we're in our first draft or we're just sort of figuring out what our story is, we can have the renovations be wherever the renovations are. That's fine. But one of the points of inequality, one of the things to consider here is that there's corruption around every corner. Now, all of a sudden, we're starting to use the world building to set atmosphere. And that is a sign of effective world building. When it's no longer just a presentation of fact, your world building is infinitely more effective. Because otherwise, it's just you showing off stuff you made up, which is what the whole book is anyway. You don't have to go overboard with the world building. I know it's fun when there were no stakes, no criticism, and no real point to it. It seemed like you were doing a lot of writing, and you were being imaginative, and writing is the act of making decisions, and you were making decisions. You were deciding these things exist. But the next level past that is purpose, utility. We can make decisions, but what are we going to do with this stuff now that we've decided about it? So let's bring this in even further. With our 19th century English countryside, we're going to make sure there's a body in a library, because that's where we want to have the big climactic scene. And if we're sort of looking at the overall way we connect our world to our plot, there's 30 guests, 30 alibis, one curious woman, two suitors, and a love of hats. Because that's how we see the story in shorthand. One woman's going to solve this murder. There's 30 other people, all with, 30 alibis. And she's got a love triangle going on that she's got to navigate while also trying to solve this murder. And everybody's wearing hats, because hats. That's how we connect our world building to our plot. Over in 21st century New York, the world is messy and awful, and somebody needs to stand up and do something. And one of the points we want to include in this is that we have anarcho-socialist halfling communes, and that wizards are capitalists, because sure they are. Why not? We got to have somebody be a capitalist, so let's have it be the wizards. So I guess we're going to fight the wizards in this urban fantasy novel. And then over in the 47th century, the Zyvar Armada in our YA novel arrives just before the prom. So it's going to fall to our two main characters. High school sophomores are going to have to save humanity from the Armada on this space station at the edge of the asteroid belt. Did we unduly come up with 10 billion things? No. We came up with just enough to create some tension and give us a little bit of information, plant some seeds that we can immediately turn into a draft. And then develop more of it as we go. This is an iterative development cycle. This is not setting the table in advance of a holiday meal where we have to cook all the food and get it on all the plates and then carry everything to the table so that everybody can serve themselves. We don't have to do all the setup in advance. You are not a better writer for having done all the setup in advance. If anything, you're just kind of waving your dick around, as one of my professors would constantly describe it. You don't want to bog yourself down. You want to free yourself up. So you want to craft just enough world building so that you have a rough sketch of an idea of the underlying potential and the underlying possibilities of what your story could have in it. And then you want to be set sort of loose and free upon the page to develop and sort out those ideas. World building is a tool to facilitate getting the story out. It's not about showing off. It's not about just detailing every inch of the past like there's going to be a quiz. It's about connecting plot and characters for the sake of story. So, are there any questions? Different races are part of world building. Yes, different races are part of world building. Dwarves, elves, anthropomorphic hamsters, etc. Yep, they're all part of world building. You'd build them the same way you'd build anything else. What do they want? What are their goals? What are they doing? How many are there? Kind of stop about there. No problem. Thanks for popping in and checking this out. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it. One point I want to make while I'm sitting here thinking about it. Your story takes place somewhere in the world of your story, someplace on the globe and somewhere in your story. You don't need to map out everything else. So for instance, let's suppose your story takes place in I don't know, a single city in a larger kingdom somewhere on a continent, you don't need to map everything. You're not going to need the extra cities. You're not going to need the extra, like, oh, by the way, there's a volcano like 2,000 miles. Nope, don't need it. Don't need it. You need to map out where the story material, the world material, relative to the characters, where they're at. And that includes backstory and lore. So if you're telling the story of, I don't know, 6 rambunctious young kids who live in a small Maine town who will later go have sex and fight a clown, we don't need to detail what the hell's going on in Florida. We don't need to go into great detail about what's going on in Luxembourg, because our story takes place in this small Maine town and these 6 kids have to just hook up and fight a clown. You keep the focus of the world building where you want to facilitate story. Is there a way you recommend keeping track of your world building details as you introduce them? Yes, the field document, which we've talked about before. A field document is basically a big blank page where you start detailing all your stuff. And that can, if you're, well, I'll answer your question in 2 ways. The field document is the easiest place to do it because it's just a big grocery list kind of a thing where we're just listing words and concepts and ideas and moods in this sort of loose, disorganized pile. You're just going to vomit it out onto the page. The field document draws its name from, I look at this document and I know how my story should feel. It's going to include not only the details like there are dwarves and there are elves and there's a steam train that runs at noon, but it's also stuff like this thing should feel moody and atmospheric and kind of like a foreign film without subtitles. If you're looking for something more concrete, like way more concrete, so that you can go, I introduced that detail on page 6 in the 4th paragraph, then you're looking for something more like crunchy, like a story Bible, which as a client, I can just send you a copy of something to fill in. Like that's more of a database kind of a spreadsheety kind of thing. That's way crunchier. Most stories don't need that, because at some point you're not going to care. I mentioned this on page 11, then page 14, then page 22. Like you don't need that much crunch, but a field document is plenty. A single page where you've identified, like, my story has this, my story doesn't have that, it's got the, blah, 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 blah. And you're just listing, like, next to the item, the chapters or sections wherein the stuff pops up. Again, it's just a pile of notes. It does not need to be broken down any further than that unless there's some significant narrative issue. Like, oh my God, it's been 7 years since I last looked at this manuscript and I'm totally gutting the middle of it. What do I do? Well, that's where we use some tools. But to answer your first question, field document, that's what we want to use. Feel, F-E-E-L. My problem is keeping it all in one place. Yeah. Single document, single file. You should have multiple copies of it, obviously, but stick it all in one place. Thanks. Appreciate it. Yes, a story Bible is crunchier by powers of 10 compared to a field document. A field document looks like a grocery list. It's just scribbles on a page, right? It's just single, like this, da, 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 da. Here, we can make one real quick now that I know how to make this work. All right, so now you are looking at what would be a field document, right? It would just be a simple thing. This would probably be labeled field document, right? And then you just start listing things. You would just start like takes place in city. City is part of the kingdom of Kevinania. I don't know. Should feel moody. It's almost always raining. And we mentioned that it's raining on page 1, page 9, page 300. Or 1,000 or whatever I typed. What about world building for a series? You do a field doc for each book. Although if you're going to go longer than 2 books, I would tell you to do a Bible, do like a crunchier document, because by the time you get to book 3, chances are you're paying off multiple arcs and setting more things up. But if you're going to go longer than 3, you definitely want to get crunchier. Absolutely. When do we need a story Bible? The crunchier things get, or the more complicated you want to make things, or the more moving parts you want to have, or the more characters you want to include, or the more organized and anal you want to be about making a thing, that's when you opt for the Bible as opposed to just a simple feel document or map. The downside in doing that is that you want to bet a wiki. It can be, but remember that all these different things, wiki and Notions and Pinterest boards and all that stuff, require setup, and it can give the impression of really being helpful. Because, oh man, I'm going to have all this document. I'm going to have all these things sorted out. And then you end up spending more time doing that than writing the thing you're supposed to be working on. You want to kind of find your own groove, find your own balance between the stuff you do to prep your work and the work you do. A wiki is not a bad format, but remember that kind of thing is very labor intensive. And it might be just straightforward, simpler to make just a list of characters, a list of scenes, a list of beats, a list of whatevers. Because again, it's just for you. How do you find a balance between not info dumping and not confusing the reader, throwing them concepts without explaining them? First of all, info dumping, it's a great question. Info dumping is not automatically bad. Info dumping tends to be, especially for multiple character scenes, dialogue driven, because it's a very natural way of expressing information between people. The balance between info dumping and not throwing the reader into the deep end with no detail is done through, 1, scene construction. What's the goal of the scene? What goals do the character have in each scene? 2, just exposition, like structure. Where are we? What's going on? What should I picture when I read this sentence? Where is the scene taking place? Who's doing what? Why? Also, not everything needs to be info dumped in order to be explained. There's a difference between saying, I'm sitting in my office and here's what it looks like, versus an info dump about it would be, John's been doing this for X number of years and the computer has been there and the desk is like this and this. Like an info dump is a volume issue as opposed to an explanation, which is less, fewer words, shorter. But your balance is, there's no universal form here, right? Your balance is going to look different than mine because you're a different writer than I am, which is a different writer than somebody next to you. So that balance is struck by you understanding, well, what am I writing in this moment? What's here? I'm in chapter, whatever chapter you're in. And who's got goals? What does this character want? There's 3 characters in the scene, A, B, and C. What are their goals? A wants this, B wants this, C wants this. Cool. How's that going? Who's doing what? Where are they at? Are we doing A? Are we doing B? Are we doing C? How does this bounce off each other? That's it. That's enough. And then trusting that you've done a good enough job framing and developing your scenes and moving your story forward that the reader's not going to be confused because you've done more than just give them the very starved plot. You've put a movie in their brain. Do not assume the reader will automatically be confused either. Readers aren't stupid unless you treat them like they're stupid. Great question. But some of this stuff you're going to explain and some of this stuff you're not. And you're just going to trust them to, figure out 2 + 2 via context clues. You don't need to explain everything to them, even if this stuff is new. Like a magic system, a spell somebody casts does not need to be broken down to the subatomic level, for instance, because unless you want to, but there's no benefit to it other than wow, the author really sat down and thought about quarks. But if you just demonstrate magic, I point my finger at them and, special effects happen. Cool. I guess that's what happens. That balance is found through drafting, through organizing your scenes. It's a great question. What else? Yes, you can absolutely get a copy. I will make sure I stick it in the Discord. Anybody else? Anything. Does not have to be about world building. Can be about whatever. Else? Which is better? What does better mean? There's no better. It's just what you want to do. If you like numbers, do numbers. If you like names, do names. There's no better. I mean, I am not one. I have strong opinions about many things. Chapter labeling is not one of them. Do whatever makes you happy. Sure. I mean, the only thing that you get any kind of publishing note about is that you don't want your chapter naming convention to spoil any event in your chapter. Like if it's supposed to be a big twist that somebody dies in the chapter, let's say Tom dies in this chapter. Don't name the chapter the one where Tom dies, because that kind of gives away the big surprise. But beyond that, it doesn't matter. Do whatever makes you happy. Hang on. A few times while writing, I've gotten stuck with the need to come up with some particular world-building detail, like you're too long researching the numbers of the kinds of carriages. Yes. How do I avoid these rabbit holes? Tell yourself 2 things. 1, there's not going to be a quiz at the end of my book. And 2, you just need a carriage, right? Like, what's the problem I am trying to solve in this moment? I need to put my characters on a carriage. Great, do that. How do we know if we don't have enough world building? Ooh, what an interesting question. you're gonna lack world building when your story, like when the plot starts right the hell away, and we're just sort of not getting anything explained to us. We're just going very fast, watching people do things. We've sort of like raced ahead to an under-described plot, and we're just writing to write. Most of the time, that's usually a sign that we don't have enough world building, because everything seems so ephemeral and so weak, and it just becomes about I gotta have the story. I can't let the reader slow down. I gotta go at 1,000,000 miles an hour for some kind of usually childish, pointless reason. World building is usually the thing sacrificed for the sake of speed, when you don't need to. Speed will sort itself out. I wish more writers understood that. But a lack of world building is usually because the plot, like you've jumped too deep into the plot too quickly, and we're just doing the story. And you're not really stopping and explaining anything out of some fear that I don't want to slow down. I don't want to bore the reader. I don't want to lose anything. I want to keep the story engaging, as if, stopping and describing the room you're in for a paragraph is so catastrophic and so detrimental that you can't even be bothered to do it. That is when you don't have enough world building. Because yes, exposition, our old friend, is world building. There is a reason I ask, what should I picture in my mind when I read this sentence? I'm looking for the immediate details of world building. What should I see? Where is this thing taking place? I'm in a garage. I'm in a warehouse. I'm underwater. I'm in the third tallest tower of the palace. Most of the time, people skip on world building out of some fear that it'll take too long or it'll be slow, as if we have to do like page upon page upon, like the early chapters need to be world building and then we'll get to the story. And that is such a gross misunderstanding of 3-act structure and story structure and plotting and writing in general, that it's almost always a problem. And I got to tell you, as a coach, the people who generally worry most about that are the ones who won't finish their draft anyway. So we're just kind of going around in circles on that. But yeah, you're gonna, if you're painting a picture for the reader, if you're making sure that when we read a sentence we know what's supposed to be pictured in our brain, and we are telling a story, and we're not just racing to do the plot, your world building needs will be very apparent. And by the way, if you also read, you will see that there is a wide variety of world building available. I mean, unless you're reading truly awful, poorly crafted work and only poorly crafted work, then you will not see the advantage and benefit of crafting a world. But if you go out and read not shit, you'll see that world building does not require, for instance, a complete breakdown of the 6 different kinds of European and British carriages in the 19th century. It can just be, a 2-seater or a 4-seater or more. Good question. Anything else? You do not have to figure out the great intricacies of a magic system. So when you're making a magic system, the basics you need to get started with are What does the magic do? And how is magic going to be used by my characters? Any answer beyond those two things is extra. So if you're like, well, there's magic that heals, and there's magic that causes harm, and there's magic that gains information, and there's magic that changes one element to another. 4 very basic types of magic. Great. That's enough to get started. And then you can give it a fancy label. You can make it colors, you can make it elements, you can name it after certain things, whatever. That's just labeling. That's fine. You can change that with find and replace. That's no big deal. But beyond that, knowing, for instance, that like, oh, there's microscopic superorganisms that exist in the dark space between reality, and they're influenced by wiggling our fingers or something. You do not need that level of detail. No one's going to need that level of detail. Just do enough magic development to get done the thing you need to get done. And I promise you, it will seem like, to a reader, you've done vastly more work than you have. That doesn't mean do the bare minimum. I'm not saying do the bare minimum. I'm just saying that identifying what it does and identifying sort of like what the goal and the function of it is will answer the majority of the questions people may have, as well as give you the opportunity in the story to have magic work. If you want to go one additional step and say it works and everybody has wands, or everybody has a focus item, or everybody speaks a gibberish language or whatever, sure, that's fine. But you don't need to like nail out at 6th level you will get 4 spell slots, and at 9th level you'll get 6 spell slots plus an extra spell every 2 turns. Like you don't need to over mechanize this. You just need to have a thing that helps you tell the story you want to tell. Again, do not make the hard thing any harder. You're doing enough telling a story. You are not a better or worse writer for not doing 10,000 times the work as the person to your left or right. Anybody else? Otherwise, we will get out of here for the day. All right. I think that's it. So let us stop this recording and, we'll go from there. Thanks so much for checking this out. I'm pressing the button, stopping the recording, and we'll talk soon.